Hi, my name is Ken from the NetBeans documentation team, and in this screencast I will demonstrate how to use NetBeans IDE to create a simple web application that enables collaboration between client browsers that are connected to a single WebSocket endpoint. The Java API for WebSocket is part of the Java EE7 specification and is available with the Glassfish 4.0 application server. The application uses JSON to transmit information about the shape, color, and position of items on the whiteboard canvas. The Java API for JSON processing is part of the Java EE7 specification and is available with Glassfish 4.0. So I start off by using the new project wizard to create a web application project. In the wizard, I first enter the name of the project and the location. For this Java EE7 application, I need to specify Glassfish 4 as the server. Glassfish 4 is the reference implementation of Java EE7, which is required for the technologies that are used in this project. After I switch the server to Glassfish 4, I can now select Java EE7 as the version in the wizard. I click Finish, and the IDE creates the application. In the projects window, I can see that an index page for the application is generated by default. I also see that the Java EE7 Web API is listed as a project dependency. I now use a wizard to create a WebSocket endpoint. I enter the name for the class and select a package. I enter the name I will use for the WebSocket URI, which is the name of the endpoint that the clients will connect to. I click Finish in the wizard, and the IDE creates the class and opens the file in the editor. The endpoint is a simple POJO that is annotated with @serverEndpoint, and the name of the endpoint is the default parameter for the annotation. I can use the hint glyph in the margin to tell me what is missing and to help me add some missing import statements. To open the suggestions pop-up, I put the insert cursor in the line of code and type Alt-Enter. In the pop-up menu, I choose to add import statements for JAWX, WebSocket, and Java Util. I now type Alt-Enter and use the suggestions pop-up to help me add onClose and onOpen methods to the endpoint, and use code completion to help me with the code for opening and closing the session. Now I add a new JavaScript file that will initiate the WebSocket session. I paste some code into the file that specifies the endpoint and creates a new WebSocket. This is all that is needed to perform the handshake with the server. The handshake is made when the browser loads the JavaScript file. Now I modify the index page to change the page heading and to add a script element to load the JavaScript file to initiate the handshake. I also add a basic table that is a form element and add the HTML5 canvas for drawing images. Now I create a class named Figure that is also a simple POJO. I add a constructor, a getter and setter for the JSON object, and a toString method that uses JSON writer. I now create another class, which is a basic helper class called coordinates, and this handles the positions of the figures in the canvas, and I paste in some basic code. I need to create a JavaScript file that will initialize the canvas in the index page and define the image. I use the wizard to create the whiteboard JavaScript file, and in the editor I add some initialization code and an event listener that listens to changes in the canvas. Then I add the methods that specify the values that will be used for the JSON string, that is, the position, the color, and the shape. The define image method writes the string and invokes the sendText method to send the JSON string. In the WebSocket JavaScript file, I add the sendText method and also the onMessage method that invokes the drawImageText method when a JSON string is received. I update the code in the index page to load the WebSocket JavaScript file. Now I create encoder and decoder classes that will convert objects to strings for JSON and back again. In the encoder class, I implement the encoder interface to convert the figure object to text for JSON. I type Alt-Enter to open up the pop-up menu and implement the default abstract methods. I then modify the encode method to specify figure and add simple output lines for the init and destroy methods. I create the decoder class, and this converts an incoming JSON string to an object. In this case, I implement the decoder interface after I create the class, implement the abstract methods, and modify the decode and will decode methods that the IDE generated. The next step is to update the endpoint class to register the encoder and decoder classes. I do this by modifying the @server endpoint annotation to add encoder and decoder elements. I also need to add a value element to the annotation so that the name of the endpoint is explicitly specified. I replace the default onMessage method with a new broadcast figure method that will send the JSON message to connected peers. Now I can run the application. I right-click the project in the project node and choose Run in the pop-up menu, and the IDE builds and deploys the application to the Glassfish server. The index page of the application opens my default browser, which is Firefox in this case. To demonstrate how the application works, I will use two browsers. Here I am using Firefox at the top and Safari at the bottom. I open the same application URL in Safari. Now both browser clients are connected to the same endpoint, and they can send data using WebSocket to each other. When I click in the canvas in the Safari browser, the image also appears in the Firefox browser, and there's basically no latency. When I switch to Firefox and draw on the canvas, the image appears in Safari. Thank you for watching this screencast demonstrating NetBeans support for the WebSocket and JSON APIs that are now part of the Java EE7 specification.